A German shepherd adopted 3 orphaned kittens, but when they grew up, the unthinkable happens. At first, it looked like the perfect family. 1 scarred old dog, 3 helpless kittens bound together by love and survival. The bond seemed unbreakable. But as the kittens grew, something darker began to stir. Strange tracks appeared in the dirt, traps hidden in the grass, and the dog's instincts told him danger was closing in. These kittens weren't left behind by accident. A hidden truth is waiting to tear this family apart. And when loyalty is tested against wild blood, the fight for survival turns deadly. Will the dog who once saved them be able to protect them again? Or will growing up mean losing everything they built together? This space is built on something simple and enduring: the power of love, the truth in kindness, and the belief that quiet care can still change lives. The autumn wind howled across the Colorado plains, rattling the windows of Clara Whitford's weathered farmhouse. She sat in her favorite armchair, a worn quilt draped across her lap, watching her newly adopted German shepherd, Bruno, as he lay near the crackling fireplace. His scarred body and torn ear told stories of past hardships, but his eyes held a gentle wisdom that had drawn Clara to him at the shelter. Thunder crashed outside, making the old house creak. Bruno's head snapped up, his ears alert. Clara noticed his sudden change in posture. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, setting aside her coffee mug. The dog rose to his feet, his powerful frame moving with purpose despite his slight limp. He padded to the door and scratched at it insistently. Clara hesitated. The storm was fierce and the temperature had dropped below freezing, but Bruno's whining grew more urgent. All right, Clara sighed, pulling on her heavy coat and rubber boots. She opened the door, and Bruno shot out into the darkness. "Bruno!" she called after him, her voice nearly lost in the wind. For 15 tense minutes, Clara stood at the door, scanning the darkness with her flashlight. The beam caught occasional glimpses of Bruno's form as he searched the perimeter of the house. Just as she was about to give up hope, she heard his familiar bark. Bruno emerged from the shadows, but he wasn't alone. In his gentle jaws, he carried something small and wet. As he drew closer, Clara's heart caught in her throat. It was a tiny kitten, barely bigger than her hand. But before she could react, Bruno turned and disappeared again into the storm. "Oh, my word," Clara whispered, cradling the shivering kitten against her chest. Its fur was soaked through, its tiny body ice cold. She quickly grabbed a kitchen towel and began rubbing it dry, her practiced hands careful with the fragile creature. 2 more times Bruno ventured out, each time returning with another precious bundle. By the time he was done, 3 small kittens, huddled together on Clara's kitchen floor, wrapped in warm towels. Bruno stood guard over them, his large body curved protectively around their makeshift nest. Clara worked quickly, warming some milk on the stove and finding an eyedropper in her medical kit. "They can't be more than 4 weeks old," she murmured, examining each kitten carefully. One was gray with white paws, another solid black, and the third a patchwork of orange and white. What amazed her most was Bruno's behavior. The German shepherd, who had shown such wariness of other animals at the shelter, now tenderly nosed each kitten, cleaning their faces with gentle licks. When Clara approached with the warmed milk, he watched attentively but didn't interfere, seeming to understand she was helping. "Well, I never expected this from you, big fellow," Clara said, smiling as she fed each kitten in turn. Bruno's tail wagged slowly, his eyes never leaving his adopted charges. "You're just full of surprises, aren't you?" As the night wore on, Clara created a comfortable bed for the kittens, using a cardboard box and soft blankets. She placed it near the fireplace, but Bruno had other ideas. He carefully picked up each kitten by the scruff of its neck, just as a mother cat would, and moved them to his own bed in the corner. Then he settled down around them, creating a warm, protective barrier with his body. Clara watched in wonder as the tiny kittens snuggled into Bruno's fur, their previous trauma, forgotten in the safety of his presence. The big dog's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that touched her deeply. A plea, a promise, a connection that transcended words. "Yes, they can stay," she said softly, reaching out to scratch behind his torn ear. "We'll take care of them together." That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara felt something shift in her heart. The quiet emptiness of her home had been filled with new life, new purpose. She watched as Bruno dozed with his precious charges, his large body rising and falling with each breath, the kittens moving in sync with his rhythm. For the first time in years since losing her husband, Clara felt the warmth of family again. It wasn't the family she had expected, a battle-scarred German shepherd and 3 orphaned kittens, but somehow it felt right. Bruno had brought more than just kittens into her home that night. He had brought hope, healing, and the reminder that love could come in the most unexpected packages. As she prepared for bed, Clara paused to check on her newly expanded family one last time. Bruno opened one eye, acknowledging her presence with a gentle thump of his tail. The kittens were sound asleep, tiny paws twitching as they dreamed, safe and warm against their unlikely guardian's body. "Good boy, Bruno," Clara whispered. "Good boy." The morning after the storm broke crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through Clara's kitchen windows. She stood at the counter, sipping her coffee and watching Bruno tend to his adopted family. The big dog hadn't left the kitten's side. All night and even now, he was carefully inspecting each one, giving them gentle nudges with his nose. "They need names," Clara said softly, setting down her cup. The gray kitten with white paws caught her eye first, a bold little fellow who was already trying to climb over Bruno's paw. "You're going to be Ash," she decided, watching him tumble back into his siblings. The calico female, smaller than the others but alert and watchful, reminded Clara of her grandmother's cat. "Mabel," she whispered, and the kitten's ears twitched as if in approval. The dark tabby, who seemed to possess a restless energy even in sleep, she named Flint. Bruno's dedication to his charges amazed Clara more with each passing day. When she set out his breakfast that first morning, he wouldn't touch it until all 3 kittens had their fill of warmed milk. He watched anxiously as Clara showed them how to lap from a shallow dish, his tail wagging with pride when they finally got the hang of it. At night, the sound of coyotes echoing across the ranch would set Bruno on high alert. He'd position himself between the door and his kittens, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest if the wild sounds drew too close. Clara would watch from her chair, touched by his fierce protectiveness. "You're something special, aren't you?" she'd say, and Bruno would glance at her with those intelligent eyes before returning to his vigil. As the kittens grew stronger, they began exploring their new world. Ash led the charge, venturing furthest from Bruno's watchful eye. Mabel preferred to stay close, often curling up in the curve of Bruno's tail. Flint would alternate between bold adventures and sudden retreats to the safety of Bruno's side. Clara found herself talking more than she had in years. "Look at them go," she'd say to Bruno as the kittens wobbled across the kitchen floor. "They're getting braver every day." The big dog would wag his tail, sharing in her joy at their progress. The silence that had once filled her home gave way to the patter of tiny paws, the squeak of playful kittens, and Bruno's gentle huffs of contentment. Clara caught herself smiling more often, laughing at their antics. When Ash tried to chase his own tail and tumbled head over heels, she found herself letting out a real laugh, the kind that bubbled up from deep inside, the kind she hadn't experienced since Tom's passing. The thought of Tom still brought an ache to her heart, but somehow it felt different now. As she watched Bruno teaching the kittens to play, showing remarkable restraint with his size and strength, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't that the grief was gone, but rather that it had made room for something new. Hope. One evening, as the sun painted the kitchen in warm golden light, Clara sat in her rocking chair watching her unlikely family. Bruno lay stretched out. On his side, all 3 kittens climbing over him like he was their personal mountain. He didn't mind when they tugged at his ears or batted at his tail. His patience seemed endless. "You know what, Bruno?" Clara said, her voice soft with emotion. "I think you're teaching me as much as you're teaching them." The dog lifted his head, meeting her gaze with those understanding eyes. About love, about family, about starting over. The kittens had brought noise and chaos into her once orderly home. There were now toys scattered across the floor, tiny paw prints on the windows, and the occasional overturned water bowl. But they'd brought something else too, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat, a fullness that made the house feel like a home again. Bruno's devotion to his adopted family touched something deep in Clara's soul. Here was this dog, who had known such cruelty at human hands, showing more love and gentleness than many people she'd known. He'd transformed from the wary, defensive creature she'd brought home from the shelter into a patient, nurturing guardian. As Clara watched Bruno carefully herd Ash back from wandering too close to the door, she felt tears prick at her eyes. Not the lonely tears she'd grown used to, but tears of gratitude. This strange, mismatched family of hers might not be what she'd imagined for herself, but it was exactly what she needed. The kittens were growing stronger every day, their personalities emerging more clearly, but it was Clara who felt herself truly coming back to life, awakening from the long winter of her grief into something new and unexpected. In caring for these small lives, in witnessing Bruno's unwavering dedication, she was learning to open her heart again. The seasons turned slowly on Clara's ranch, painting the landscape in shifting colors as spring melted into summer and summer aged into early fall. What had once been tiny balls of fluff grew into sleek, confident cats, each with their own distinct personality shining through. Bruno watched his charges with the same devotion he'd shown since that first stormy night. But now their adventures took them further afield. In the cool mornings, he'd lead them on careful explorations of the ranch, showing them how to stalk through the tall grass and teaching them the ways of their territory. Ash, the bold gray tomcat, grew more daring with each passing day. Where once he'd stayed close to Bruno's protective shadow, now he'd sprint ahead, disappearing into the grass only to pop up yards away, yellow eyes gleaming with mischief. Clara would watch from the porch as Bruno padded after him, patient but alert, like a worried parent letting their child test their wings. "He's getting quite adventurous, isn't he?" Clara would say to Bruno, who'd respond with a soft whine, his torn ear twitching with concern. Flint, the dark tabby, showed his own kind of restlessness. He'd pace the fence line, muscles rippling under his sleek coat, amber eyes fixed on the distant hills. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, watching the wild rabbits that ventured near the property's edge, his tail twitching with barely contained energy. Only Mabel, the little calico, remained steadfast in her devotion. She'd become Bruno's constant companion, matching his protective instincts with her own watchful nature. When Clara worked in the garden, Mabel would perch nearby, her green eyes alert for any sign of trouble. At night, she'd curl up next to Bruno on his bed, while her brothers increasingly chose to roam. Bruno's behavior began to shift as summer waned. Clara noticed it first in the way he'd stand at attention, scanning the horizon with intense focus. His protective instincts, always strong, grew sharper. He'd interrupt his own meals to check on the cats, especially when Ash or Flint stayed out longer than usual. One warm afternoon, Clara watched from the kitchen window as Bruno paced the yard, his nose working overtime. He'd stop, test the air, then continue his circuit with military precision. Mabel followed close behind, mirroring his concern. "What's got you so worked up, old friend?" Clara asked when Bruno finally came inside. He pressed against her leg, something troubled in his dark eyes. She scratched behind his torn ear, feeling the tension in his powerful frame. "You're worried about them too, aren't you?" The change was subtle at first. Ash staying out past sunset, Flint disappearing for hours at a time. Bruno would wait by the door, his tail low until they returned. When they did come home, they carried new scents on their fur, wild smells that made Bruno's nose twitch and his muscles tense. During their morning explorations, the family dynamic shifted. Where once they'd moved as a unit, now Ash would break, away, drawn by distant sounds or movements. Flint would hesitate at the boundary of their usual territory, torn between following his brother and staying with the group. Only Mabel remained constant, her calico coat brushing against Bruno's legs as they walked. Clara felt the change too, though she tried to dismiss it as natural growing pains. But there was something in Bruno's alertness, in the way he'd position himself between the cats and the wilderness beyond the ranch, that spoke of deeper concerns. His protective instincts, honed by years of hardship before finding Clara, seemed to be warning of something beyond simple wanderlust. The German shepherds, limp, usually barely noticeable, became more pronounced in the evenings after long days of keeping watch. Still, he never complained, never faltered in his duty. If anything, his dedication intensified. He'd wait up until all three cats were safely inside before settling down for the night, and even then, his ears would twitch at every unusual sound. "They're growing up," Clara would tell him, trying to soothe his anxiety. "It's natural for them to explore." But Bruno's worried eyes told her he sensed something more, something she couldn't yet see. The afternoon walks became a study in growing independence. Ash would dart ahead, ignoring Bruno's gentle woofs calling him back. Flint would disappear into the brush, only to emerge with wild eyes and bristled fur. As if he'd seen something that both frightened and excited him, Mabel would press closer to Bruno, sharing his unease. Clara watched this gradual separation with a heavy heart, understanding all too well the pain of watching loved ones drift away. She saw it in Bruno's vigilant stance, in the way he'd scan the horizon long after Ash and Flint had disappeared from view. The once tight family unit was slowly unraveling, pulled apart by the natural instincts that called to the young cats. Yet Bruno never gave up his role as guardian. If anything, his protective nature grew stronger as the distance between them widened. He seemed to sense something on the wind, something that made him stand watch long into the night, his powerful frame silhouetted against the moon-bright sky. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp autumn morning. Clara was checking the fence line when something caught her eye, a glint of metal half hidden in the tall grass. Bending down, she discovered a wire snare, expertly concealed and cruelly designed. Her hands trembled as she dismantled it. "Who would put this here?" she whispered, scanning the surrounding area. Bruno stood alert beside her, his ears forward and nose working overtime. The discovery left Clara unsettled, but it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, she found more disturbing evidence. Strange bits of bait scattered near the property line, scraps of meat that smelled wrong, tainted somehow. Footprints that didn't belong to any of her neighbors crossed the softer patches of earth. Someone had been watching, waiting. Bruno grew more agitated with each discovery. He'd bark at shadows in the night, positioning himself between the cats and whatever threat he sensed lurking beyond the darkness. Clara started keeping the cats inside after sunset, though Ash and Flint protested the confinement. One afternoon, Clara rode into town for supplies, her mind heavy with worry. At the general store, she overheard two men talking in low voices about a local trapper named Levi Garrison. "Mean as they come," one man muttered. Heard he poisoned Miller's Creek just to drive out the competition. Doesn't care what dies long as he gets his furs. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She'd heard that name before, whispered with fear and disgust. Garrison had a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond just trapping. He'd clear whole areas of wildlife using any means necessary, legal or not. The store owner, Tom, noticed her listening. After the other customers left, he approached her with concern etched on his weathered face. "Miss Whitford, you been having any trouble out at your place?" When Clara described the traps and strange signs, Tom's expression darkened. "That'll be Garrison's work. He's been bragging down at the saloon about some valuable stock he's got coming due. Said something about special cats he's breeding, wild ones that fetch a high price from fancy folks back east." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Clara remembered that stormy night when Bruno had brought the kittens home, so small, so helpless. "He abandoned them," she whispered, her voice thick with anger. "Left them to die in the cold, planning to come back once they were grown." Tom nodded grimly. "Garrison's got a system. Lets the mothers raise the kittens wild, then takes them once they're old enough to sell. Folks say he's got breeding pairs stashed all over the county." Clara's hands clenched into fists. She thought of Bruno's desperate rescue that night, of how he'd refused to leave the kittens behind. Had he somehow known? Had his protective instincts recognized the evil that had placed them there? Back at the ranch, Clara watched her makeshift family with new eyes. Ash's wanderlust, Flint's growing wildness. It wasn't just natural independence. They were answering some call bred into them, a wildness Garrison had cultivated for his own profit. That evening, as Clara secured the barn, she found fresh boot prints in the soft earth behind the structure. Large prints, deliberately placed. Someone had been watching her home, studying the routine of her unusual family. The thought sent chills down her spine. Bruno appeared at her side, hackles raised. He'd known all along that danger was coming. His increased vigilance, his anxiety when the cat strayed too far. He'd been trying to protect them from a threat he could smell, but couldn't fight alone. Clara knelt beside her faithful companion, running her hand through his thick fur. "We won't let him take them," she promised quietly. "They're our family now, and we protect our own." But as darkness fell and Clara locked up the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Levi Garrison had invested time and effort in breeding these cats. He wouldn't give them up easily. The traps and lures were just his opening moves in a game where the stakes were life and death. Inside, Mabel pressed against Clara's legs, purring softly, while Bruno took up his guard position by the door. Somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. Bruno's low growl rumbled through the quiet house, a warning to whatever watched from the shadows that this family would not be broken without a fight. Clara loaded her husband's old shotgun and placed it by her bed. She wouldn't let fear rule her, but neither would she ignore the danger. Garrison had made a mistake in targeting her family. He'd assumed she was just a lonely widow, easy to intimidate, but Clara Whitford had survived loss and loneliness, had carved out a life from unforgiving land. She would not surrender what she loved to a man who saw only profit in the suffering of innocent creatures. The truth of the kittens' origins had been revealed, but it changed nothing about how Clara felt. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. These cats weren't Garrison's property. They were living beings who had found love and safety with her and Bruno. She would defend them, whatever the cost. Clara woke to Bruno's urgent barking at dawn. The sound carried a different note today, sharp, insistent, warning of danger. She threw on her coat and boots, rushing outside to find Bruno circling anxiously near the chicken coop. The morning mist hadn't lifted yet, creating ghostly shapes across her land. As she approached, her stomach turned at what she found. Metal teeth glinted in the weak light. traps, deliberately set where her animals would likely step. They were cruel devices with serrated edges, designed not just to catch, but to maim. "Stay. Back!" she commanded Bruno, who whined but obeyed. Clara carefully marked each trap's location, counting 6 in total. Her hands shook with anger as she worked to disarm them. These weren't the simple snares she'd found before. These were professional, grade steel traps, the kind that could snap a leg clean through. A commotion from the pasture caught her attention. Her sheep were bleating in panic, and she heard the distinct sound of her mare in distress. Before she could stop him, Bruno shot past her, racing toward the noise. "Bruno, no!" Clara called, but it was too late. The snap of metal was followed by a heart-wrenching yelp. Clara ran toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. She found Bruno trapped, his back leg caught in the vicious grip of another hidden snare. Blood stained his fur as he struggled, whimpering in pain. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" Clara whispered, falling to her knees beside him. Bruno tried to lick her hand, still more concerned with comforting her than his own suffering. With trembling fingers, she worked to release the mechanism, talking softly to keep him calm. "Stay still, boy. I've got you. I've got you." When she finally freed him, Bruno couldn't put weight on the injured leg. The trap had torn deep into muscle and possibly damaged bone. Clara helped him back to the house, her mind racing with fury and fear. Bruno had taken that trap meant for her animals, or worse, meant for the cats. As she cleaned and bandaged Bruno's leg, Clara heard snippets of conversation from yesterday at the feed store. "Miller's Creek's gone bad," they'd said. "Fish floating, belly up. Deer found dead on the banks." She'd dismissed it then, but now the pieces fell into place. Later that afternoon, Clara rode out to investigate, leaving Bruno resting at home. The creek ran along the edge of her property, a vital water source for wildlife and livestock alike. The signs of devastation were immediate. Dead fish littered the banks, their scales dulled and flesh rotting. A young deer lay half in the water, its body twisted in what must have been an agonizing death. The water itself had a strange sheen, and an acrid smell rose from its surface. Clara found empty bottles hidden under brush near the bank, their labels worn but warning symbols still visible. Poison. Levi hadn't just set traps. He was systematically destroying the ecosystem to control the territory. "Thought you might show up here," a rough voice called out. Clara turned to find Levi Garrison emerging from the trees, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Shame about your dog. Should keep him." Closer to home, Clara's hand inched toward her own rifle. "You're poisoning the creek." "Just managing the competition," Levi shrugged. "Can't trap what ain't there to trap, but that's not what you're really worried about, is it?" His smile widened. "How are those cats of mine doing?" "They're not yours," Clara said firmly, though her heart pounded. "You abandoned them." Levi took a step closer. "I invested time and money breeding those cats. Several generations of careful selection to get that wild strain just right. Rich folks pay good money for exotic pets, and those 3 are prime stock." His voice hardened. "I'll be collecting them soon. Best keep. That crippled mutt out of my way when I do." Clara felt cold despite the afternoon sun. This wasn't just about the cats anymore. Levi was laying claim to everything. The land, the water, the wildlife. Her peaceful existence was being systematically destroyed by a man who saw the world only in terms of profit and power. "You're destroying everything," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "The creek, the animals, the balance of nature itself." "Nature?" Levi laughed harshly. "Nature's just another resource to be managed, like those cats, like this land, like you." He adjusted his rifle meaningfully. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, widow woman." Clara held his gaze, refusing to show fear. "Get off my property, Levi. and stay off." He smiled again, cold and calculating. "We'll see about that." Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Clara with the dead creek and the weight of his threats. When she returned home, she found Bruno waiting at the door despite his injury. He thumped his tail weakly, still trying to do his job even while hurt. Clara knelt beside him, burying her face in his fur. "What are we going to do, boy?" she whispered. Bruno's injury was more than just a wound. It was a message. Levi would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The quiet life Clara had built. The family she had found in Bruno and the cats. The very land itself. All of it was under siege from a man who had no conscience, no limits to his greed. The autumn wind carried a chill that matched Clara's growing unease. In the days following Bruno's injury, she noticed subtle changes in the cat's behavior. While Mabel remained a constant presence, curled up next to Bruno as he recovered, Ash and Flint grew increasingly distant. They would disappear for hours, returning with a wild look in their eyes that hadn't been there before. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch watching the sunset, Mabel paced anxiously at her feet. The calico cat's green eyes held an unusual intensity, and she kept moving between Clara and the tree line, meowing insistently. "What is it, girl?" Clara asked, concerned by the cat's strange behavior. Mabel had always been the quiet one, more observer than attention seeker. Inside, Bruno struggled to his feet, his injured leg still tender. He whined softly, sensing Mabel's distress. Clara stood, her heart quickening as Mabel darted toward the trees, then looked back expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Clara grabbed her rifle and jacket. "Stay here, Bruno," she ordered when the shepherd tried to limp after her. "Guard the house." Mabel led Clara through the darkening woods, moving with purpose. The cat paused frequently, ensuring Clara kept pace, then pressed onward. They traveled nearly a mile, deeper into the forest than Clara usually ventured. The sound of running water grew louder. They were approaching Miller's Creek, where Clara had confronted Levi. Suddenly, Mabel dropped into a crouch, creeping forward beneath a thick tangle of brush. Clara followed her example, moving as quietly as possible. Through the branches, she spotted a clearing she'd never seen before. What she saw made her blood run cold. A camp lay hidden in the natural hollow. Stacked cages lined one side, the kind used for trapping wild animals, but it was the occupied cages that made Clara's heart clench. Ash and Flint paced inside separate enclosures, their movements agitated and confused. Levi sat by a small fire, cleaning his rifle. He'd laid out dishes of food near the cages, rich-smelling fish and meat that would appeal to the cat's wild instincts. Clara watched in dismay as her two cats responded to the offerings, pushing against their cage bars to reach the tempting morsels. "That's right," Levi murmured to them. "Remember what you really are. You ain't meant to be house pets following some dog around. You've got wild blood in you, valuable blood." Clara's hands tightened on her rifle as she watched Ash and Flint's reactions. They seemed torn, responding to both Levi's voice and the wild sense around them, yet occasionally looking back toward the direction of home with uncertain eyes. Mabel pressed against Clara's leg, trembling slightly. Unlike her siblings, she had chosen her loyalty without hesitation. She'd led Clara here, revealing her siblings' capture and Levi's true nature. The Calico's choice stood in stark contrast to Ash and Flint's wavering allegiance. Clara felt a deep ache in her chest. The family she'd built was fracturing. It wasn't just about protecting the cats from Levi's physical traps anymore. She was fighting for their hearts, for the bonds that had transformed her lonely existence into something meaningful. She thought of Bruno back at the house, still faithfully guarding their home despite his injury. He had chosen them all, from the moment he'd dragged 3 freezing kittens to safety. That choice had sparked something powerful, A family forged not by blood, but by love and loyalty. Now, watching Ash and Flint in those cages, Clara realized the true nature of the battle ahead. Levi wasn't just trying to capture the cats. He was trying to awaken something wild in them, something that would break their bonds with Bruno and herself. The physical cages were just the beginning. The real prison was the doubt he was sowing in their hearts. Mabel nudged Clara's hand, her message clear. They needed to act. But as Clara raised her rifle, Levi suddenly stood, scanning the trees. She pulled back into deeper cover, knowing she couldn't take on an armed man alone in the growing darkness. The risk was too great. One wrong move could mean disaster for them all. With a heavy heart, Clara retreated, Mabel staying close to her heels. They needed to be smart about this. Levi had shown his hand, but he'd also revealed something crucial. The cat's loyalty wasn't a given. It had to be earned and protected just like any other precious thing. Back at the house, Bruno greeted them at the door, his concern evident in his whimpers. Mabel went straight to him, rubbing against his good leg as if to reassure him. Clara knelt beside them both, drawing strength from their unwavering devotion. "We'll get them back," she promised, scratching behind Bruno's ears. All of them. Not just their bodies, but their hearts, too. Bruno's tail thumped against the floor, and Mabel purred her agreement. They were still a family. Maybe not whole at the moment, but bound by something stronger than Levi's traps and tricks. Clara knew the fight ahead would test them all. But looking at Mabel's steadfast presence beside Bruno, she felt a fierce determination rise within her. Some bonds once forged could withstand any challenge. She would prove that to Ash and Flint, no matter what it took. Clara spent hours studying Levi's camp from a hidden vantage point, memorizing every detail. Mabel stayed beside her, green eyes alert, offering silent support. As midnight approached, clouds veiled the moon, perfect cover for what needed to be done. "Stay close," Clara whispered to Mabel as they crept toward the camp. The calico moved like a shadow, leading the way through paths she'd discovered. Clara's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady on her rifle. Levi's camp was quiet except for the dying embers of his fire. She could see him sleeping near the entrance of his tent, rifle within arm's reach. The cages containing Ash and Flint were stacked against a fallen log, their metal glinting dully in the faint light. Clara moved with deliberate slowness, placing each foot carefully to avoid any sound. Mabel circled the perimeter, watching for danger. When Clara reached the cages, she found Ash and Flint awake, their eyes reflecting the dim firelight. They recognized her, but their response was uncertain, a hesitation that hurt more than outright rejection would have. The cage latches were secured with simple pins. Clara's fingers trembled as she worked them free, painfully aware of Levi's proximity. The first cage opened with a slight squeak that seemed deafening in the night air. She froze, watching Levi, but he only shifted in his sleep. Ash emerged cautiously, then Flint from the second cage. Clara beckoned them to follow, but they lingered, looking between her and the dishes of tempting food Levi had left. It was Mabel who broke their indecision, approaching her siblings with quiet determination. Something passed between the cats, some silent communication that Clara couldn't understand, but desperately hoped would bring her family back together. A twig snapped under Clara's foot as she backed away. Levi stirred. Without waiting to see if the cats would follow, Clara turned and ran. She heard Levi shout, followed by the horrible sound of a rifle being cocked. The cats scattered into the darkness. Clara ran harder than she ever had, branches whipping at her face. Behind her, Levi's curses echoed through the trees. She didn't slow until she reached her property line, lungs burning. To her immense relief, she saw 3 cat shapes moving through the grass ahead of her. All of them had chosen to come home. But her relief was short-lived. The attack came the next evening, just as the sun was setting. Clara was in the house when she smelled the smoke. She rushed outside to find her barn engulfed in flames, the dry wood catching like kindling. The fire roared with unnatural intensity. Levi had used accelerant to ensure maximum destruction. "No!" Clara screamed, running toward the inferno. The heat hit her like a wall, driving her back. Inside, she could hear the terrified sounds of her animals. The horses were kicking at their stalls. The chickens were in a panic. She ran for the barn doors, but the flames forced her away. Sparks rained down, catching in her hair and clothes. The cats had scattered, disappearing into the darkness. Even Mabel was nowhere to be seen. Only Bruno remained at her side, barking frantically despite his injured leg. Through the smoke, Clara caught a glimpse of Levi watching from the tree line, his face lit by the flames. He raised his hand in a mocking salute before disappearing into the shadows. The fire consumed everything: years of stored hay, tools, tack, and feed. The wooden beams groaned and cracked, sending burning debris crashing down. Clara worked desperately with her garden hose, but it was useless against such an inferno. She could only watch as the heart of her homestead burned. Some of the animals had broken free. She saw shapes running into the night. But not all had escaped. The sounds from inside the barn grew fewer, then stopped altogether. Clara fell to her knees, overcome by smoke and grief. Bruno pressed against her, whining softly. The flames painted the sky orange, casting wild shadows across the land. Clara's throat was raw from shouting, her eyes stinging from smoke and tears. This was more than destruction of property. It was an attack on everything she held dear, everything she'd built since losing her husband. As the barn collapsed in on itself, Clara felt something inside her collapse too. The peaceful life she'd known was gone. Levi had brought war to her doorstep, and now there would be no going back. The cats huddled together in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the flames. Even Ash and Flint seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. This attack had changed everything. The fire burned long into the night, reducing Clara's barn to smoldering ruins. She stayed outside, rifle across her knees, watching for Levi's return. Bruno kept guard despite his injury, and gradually the cats emerged from hiding to join their vigil. They gathered close around Clara, as if drawing strength from each other in the face of this devastating loss. Dawn would bring the full extent of the damage to light, but for now, Clara sat in the darkness with her unlikely family, knowing that their greatest test still lay ahead. The flames had destroyed her barn, but they had also burned away any hesitation about what needed to be done. This was no longer just about protecting her animals. It was about standing up to a man who would destroy anything in his path. The flames cast wild shadows as Clara heard heavy footsteps approaching through the darkness. Levi emerged from the smoke, rifle raised, his face twisted with malice. Bruno's hackles rose as he positioned himself between Clara and the threat, despite his injured leg. "Should have minded your own business," Levi snarled, advancing steadily. "Those cats were mine to claim." Clara gripped her own rifle tighter, though her hands shook. "They were never yours. You abandoned them to die. And now you'll die protecting them?" Levi's laugh was harsh. "Foolish woman." Bruno launched himself at Levi with a ferocious growl, teeth baring for the trapper's throat. But Levi was ready. The rifle swung like a club, catching Bruno mid-leap with a sickening crack. The German shepherd crashed to the ground with a yelp that tore through Clara's heart. "Bruno!" Clara screamed. The dog tried to rise but collapsed, blood matting his fur. His one good ear lay flat against his head as he whimpered. Rage burned through Clara's fear. She raised her rifle, but Levi was faster. He knocked the weapon from her hands and grabbed her throat, shoving her against the smoldering remains of the barn wall. Heat seared through her clothes as she struggled against his iron grip. "I've dealt with meddlers before," he growled, pressing harder. "You're nothing special." Clara clawed at his hands, gasping for air. Spots danced before her eyes as smoke and lack of oxygen took their toll. She kicked out, but Levi barely seemed to notice. His fingers tightened and Clara felt consciousness starting to slip away. A dark shape streaked through the firelight. Flint, who had been watching from the shadows, made his decision. With a fierce yowl, he launched himself at Levi's face, claws extended. The attack was so sudden, so unexpected, that Levi stumbled backward, losing his grip on Clara. She fell to her knees, gulping air into her burning lungs. Through watering eyes, she watched as Flint became a whirlwind of fur and claws, slashing at Levi's face and neck. The dark tabby who had seemed so close to abandoning them for the wild was now fighting with everything he had to protect his family. Levi cursed and swung wildly, trying to dislodge the cat, but Flint held on. Blood ran down the trapper's face from deep scratches. He finally managed to grab Flint and throw him, but the cat twisted in midair and landed on his feet, immediately charging back toward Levi's legs. Clara scrambled for her fallen rifle as Mabel and Ash joined the fight, darting in to bite and slash at Levi's ankles. The trapper kicked out, connecting with Mabel and sending her tumbling, but Ash and Flint pressed their attack. They moved like shadows through the smoke, striking and retreating before Levi could retaliate. Bruno, despite his injuries, dragged himself toward the fight. His loyalty would not let him abandon his family, even when badly hurt. The sight of the wounded dog still trying to protect them seemed to fuel Flint's determination. The dark tabby redoubled his attacks, focusing on Levi's face and neck with precise, devastating strikes. Blood poured from multiple wounds as Levi staggered backward, swinging blindly. His boot caught on a piece of burning debris, and he lost his balance. As he fell, Flint launched himself one final time, claws raking across Levi's eyes. The trapper's scream of pain echoed across the burning homestead. Clara retrieved her rifle and pointed it at Levi as he writhed on the ground, hands covering his bloody face. The cat circled him, hissing, while Bruno limped to Clara's side. She kept the rifle trained on Levi as she checked Bruno's injuries with trembling hands. "It's over, Levi," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke and strangulation. "Leave my land. Never come back." Levi struggled to his feet, still covering his face. Blood seeped between his fingers as he stumbled away into the darkness, leaving a trail of curses behind him. The cats watched until he disappeared, then gathered around Bruno and Clara. Flint approached Bruno cautiously, touching his nose to the dog's wounded side. The German shepherd's tail wagged weakly as he licked the cat's head. In that moment, any doubt about Flint's loyalty vanished. He had proven that the bonds of chosen family ran deeper than any wild instinct. Clara sank to her knees, gathering Bruno and the cats close as the last flames flickered in the ruins of her barn. They were alive. They were together. And they had won. Clara kept her rifle trained on Levi as she moved carefully toward him, her boots crunching on charred debris. The trapper lay curled on his side, still clutching his bloodied face where Flint's claws had struck. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice raw but steady. With her free hand, she reached down and removed the hunting knife from his belt, tossing it far away. She found rope in the remains of the barn and, despite her shaking hands, managed to bind Levi's wrists. Bruno watched from where he lay, his breathing labored but his eyes alert. The cat stayed close to him, forming a protective circle. Mabel pressed against his side, while Ash and Flint remained vigilant, their tails twitching at every sound. Clara's nearest neighbor, Tom Jenkins, arrived first, having seen the flames from his property 2 miles away. "Good Lord, Clara!" he exclaimed, taking in the scene. "I'll ride for the sheriff." Within an hour, Sheriff Matthews and his deputies arrived, their horses' hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth. The sheriff's face hardened as he surveyed the destruction in Clara's bruised throat. "We've been after Garrison for months," Matthews said, hauling Levi to his feet. found evidence of his poison traps up and down Cedar Creek. 3 ranchers lost cattle to those contaminated waters. Clara's voice was thick with emotion as she recounted everything: the abandoned kittens, the traps, Bruno's injury, and finally, the barn fire. Other neighbors arrived, bringing water buckets to douse the remaining embers and offering help. "The illegal trapping alone will put him away," Matthews assured her. "But attempted murder and arson? He won't see freedom for a long time." The sheriff's deputy led Levi, still cursing and threatening, to their wagon. Dr. Wilson, the local veterinarian, arrived to tend to Bruno. Clara held her breath as he examined the German shepherd's injuries. "The blow was severe," the doctor said, cleaning the wound. "But your dog's got a thick skull and a stronger spirit. He'll need rest and care, but he'll pull through." Relief flooded through Clara. She knelt beside Bruno, stroking his fur as Dr. Wilson wrapped his ribs and treated his other injuries. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the ground, and he licked her hand. The cats refused to leave Bruno's side during the examination. Flint especially stayed close, his green eyes fixed on the dog who had first saved him as a kitten. The dark tabby's fur was singed, and he had a small cut above one eye, but his loyalty shone undiminished. As dawn broke over the mountains, Clara stood amid the wreckage of her barn. The structure was a total loss. Tools, feed, and winter supplies all destroyed. The sight brought tears to her eyes, but they weren't tears of despair. The barn could be rebuilt. What mattered most had survived. Her neighbors were already making plans to help. "We'll have a barn raising next week," Tom Jenkins declared. "The whole community will pitch in." His wife Sarah brought blankets for the animals and hot coffee for Clara. Sheriff Matthews returned from escorting Levi to jail. "Found his camp," he reported. "Evidence of dozens of illegal traps, poisoned stocks, and stolen furs. He won't trouble anyone again." He paused, looking at Clara with respect. "You and your animals showed real courage standing up to him." Clara smiled tiredly, watching as Bruno dozed with the cats curled around him. Mabel was tucked against his chest, while Ash and Flint flanked him protectively. They were no longer just rescued strays. They were family, bound by something stronger than blood. "They taught me courage," she said softly. "Bruno showed me what it means to protect those you love, no matter the cost. And these cats..." She shook her head in wonder. "They proved that family isn't about where you come from, but who you choose to stand beside." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as neighbors worked to clear debris and salvage what they could. Clara's homestead had weathered its darkest night, and though scars remained, in Bruno's new limp, in the charred earth where the barn had stood, what emerged was stronger than before. Justice had been served, and Levi's reign of terror was over. But the real victory wasn't in his defeat. It was in the unshakable bonds that had been forged in the face of danger, between a lonely widow, a battered shepherd, and 3 cats who had chosen love over instinct. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Clara sat on her porch watching the last wisps of smoke dissipate into the clear Colorado sky. The chaos had settled, leaving behind a profound stillness that felt different from her old solitude. This quiet was full of life, of presence, of family. Bruno lay on his favorite blanket at her feet, his breathing steady despite his injuries. The cats had arranged themselves around him in their usual formation, Mabel closest to his heart, Ash perched watchfully at his head, and Flint stretched along his side. Their fur still carried traces of ash, but their eyes were bright and alert. Clara's mind wandered back to that stormy night when Bruno had first dragged those tiny, half-frozen kittens into her home. How frightened she had been then, not of the responsibility, but of opening her heart again. After losing her husband, she had wrapped herself in isolation like a protective cloak, believing it was safer to expect nothing than to risk losing everything again. But Bruno had known better. She watched as he shifted slightly, making room for Mabel to nestle closer. Despite his own past hurts, he had never hesitated to love these small creatures. His scarred body and torn ear told a story of cruelty, yet he had chosen to be gentle, to protect, to nurture. "You taught me more than I ever expected," Clara whispered, reaching down to stroke his graying muzzle. His tail thumped softly against the wooden porch in response. The cats, too, had grown into something remarkable. They were no longer the helpless kittens who needed Bruno's warmth to survive. They had become guardians in their own right. Even Ash and Flint, who had briefly been drawn to their wild nature, had proven that chosen bonds could be stronger than instinct. Sarah Jenkins returned with more coffee and settled into the chair beside Clara. "Tom and the others will be back tomorrow to start clearing the foundation," she said. "We'll have that barn up before the first snow." Clara nodded, grateful but distracted. Her eyes were fixed on her unusual family. "You know, Sarah, I used to think I knew what family meant. James and I had such plans." She paused, touching her wedding ring. "But life has its own ideas. Sometimes family finds you when you're not looking. Sometimes it comes with fur and 4 legs and hearts bigger than you could imagine." Mabel lifted her head and blinked slowly at Clara, a gesture of pure feline affection. Ash stretched and moved closer to Bruno's injured side as if lending his strength. Flint, still bearing his battle scars, purred loudly enough for both women to hear. "Look at them," Sarah marveled. "That dog raised those cats better than some humans raise their children." Clara smiled, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. Her barn might be gone, but what remained was priceless. A family forged in adversity, bound by choice rather than circumstance. Bruno had shown her that love could heal old wounds. The cats had proven that loyalty, once earned, could overcome any obstacle. As the afternoon sun bathed them in golden light, Clara felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her life had been rebuilt, not with timber and nails, but with the stronger materials of devotion and trust. In saving each other, they had all found something more precious than safety. They had found belonging. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.